Good morning, everyone. My name is Professor Budiman Minasni. I'm from the University of Sydney. Sorry, I cannot join you at Ternate because I got meetings to attend. But thanks for the committee for inviting me to present at this first international conference on sustainable development and green economy in small islands in Ternate. Selamat pagi Bapak-Bapak dan Ibu-Ibu sekalian. So today I will present my presentation. The title is about soil and climate change. So first I will talk about the existential challenge that define our human survival in this planet. So we are facing now with 6 existential challenges. That means challenges that define the human survival. So they are food security, water security, climate change, biodiversity loss, ecosystem services, and energy security. These are all global problems, not only from the world's perspective, but also I believe in Indonesia. They are complex problems. They are not easy to solve, and they are depending on one and another. But let's talk about soil security. Soil security is the capacity of the soil to secure that so that it can provide all these services that we talk about. And soil is the only variable that connects to all these 6 existential challenges, because soil produces food, it circulates water, store water, it's part of the climate change, regulating climate. It holds a lot of biodiversity. It has provide lots of ecosystem services, and it also provides crops for energy security. So it is the only variable that connects to all these 6 existential challenges that we must address in order to address all this global problem. Soil is important, as we know, and soil stores more carbon in atmosphere and plants. The carbon in the soil, if we add the carbons in the plants and the atmosphere on the land, soil still holds 2 to 3 times more carbon than atmosphere and the plant. And 99% of the human food comes from soil. And 86% of the global biodiversity in terms of plants and animals live or depend on soil one way or another. It cycles nutrients that are available to plant, and it's worth around 2.3 trillion per year. And it is the largest store of terrestrial fresh water. So this is the only source of water that plant can take up so that it can grow and support human being. But because we use soil mainly for biomass production or food production, it is also responsible for 15% of our greenhouse gas emissions. And that brings us to the issue of climate change. So every year, this is a report about emissions of greenhouse gas in terms of CO2 to the atmosphere. So in 2021, the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere is about 41 gigatons of CO2, or billion tons of CO2 in the that is being emitted by human being. That is about 49% over if we compare it into 1990. So there's a lot of CO2 that's being emitted in the atmosphere because of fossil fuel. That means the burning of fossil fuel in terms of cars, industries, and factories. That is the largest contribution of CO2 emissions due to human activities. And the second largest contribution to the CO2 emission is land use change. What do we mean by land use change? When we change the land use, primarily when we convert the forest or deforestation and convert it into cropping. This is especially very important in Indonesia. And for example, if we see the annual CO2 from land use change, the amount that is spiked in this year around 1997, this is due to the fires due to the peatland and due to the conversion of forests into into cropping area into plantation. So over time, this is one of the largest contributor of CO2 emission to the atmosphere, land use change, because we remove the trees from the forest, which was that absorb CO2 from the atmosphere, but also we release, when we cut down the forest, we release the carbon that is trapped in the trees and also trapped in the soil. And this is a continuing issue in Indonesia, the conversion from the forest into cropping area or plantation. For example, this is in Kalimantan in 2001. It's still an intact forest. We see that this picture here. But over time, in 2005, some areas has been converted into oil palm plantation. Continuing, and 2011, we see that the area is mostly oil palm plantation, and we see that because of the land use change, the removal of trees from the forest and conversion to oil palm plantation, we see the decrease in soil organic carbon, because there is no continuous input of organic matter in the soil, and we see this decline in soil organic carbon in plantations. So there are things that cause the change in the climate system or the climate change. This is a fossil energy system because we use a lot of fossil fuel, and then we release a lot of CO2 either from fossil fuel or land use change. That CO2 goes into the atmosphere, and then it becomes like a greenhouse. It traps the heat, and that heat goes back into the Earth system, and that impact into the climate on the human and natural system. That's why we call it climate change. It's not just global warming, but it's now the climate is more variable. We call it more variable climate. That means that in usual year it is wetter or even hotter than before, so you will have more prolonged drought. In some areas we have also more not just drought but also flooding. So for example, now in Europe, in Canada, in the US, there's a lot of fire because the temperature is increasing very high, and that promotes fire in the forest, which are difficult to put down. To respond to this changing climate, we need to do something to address this problem. So there's a thing called mitigation that is addressing the causes. The cause is that we have an increased CO2 in the atmosphere. To address the causes, that means that we have to remove or reduce the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. One way is to decarbonize and reduce energy demand. That means that we use renewable energy, for example, solar energy or wind energy, or we less use the car, we use, for example, bicycle or other alternative to reduce the fossil fuel. And the second one is CO2 removal. We need to do something that take out CO2 from the atmosphere and store it somewhere else. And the natural solution is, of course, using trees and soil. This is what we call as mitigation, addressing the cause of climate change. But climate change is going to happen or is already happening, so we need to do adaptation. That means addressing the impacts of climate change. And this presentation, I will talk both about mitigation and adaptation to climate change from the soil science point of view. First is the mitigation of climate change. That means we need to reduce the CO2 in the atmosphere. So what are the options? The options are that we need to put more carbon in the soil. So why is soil carbon? So if we look at the annual emission of CO2 due to human emission, approximately 9.6 gigatons of carbon is emission annually due to fossil fuel, or around 10 billion tons of carbon every year. There is emission from worldwide due to fossil fuel, 10 gigatons of carbon or 19.6. If we compare with the amount of carbon that is stored in the soil, organic carbon stored in the soil, up to 2 meters, that's around 2,400 billion tons of carbon or gigatons carbon. If we compare this 9.6 over 2400, it is just 4 per 1000, or even or 0.4%. That means that if we can increase the amount of carbon in the soil by 0.4%, 9.6 over 2400, that means that we have enough to offset the CO2 emission. That means we can take out CO2 from the atmosphere and put it in the soil, which has many benefits to the soil as well, which I will talk about. So these are what we call as natural solutions that take out CO2 from the atmosphere. So we can have it on the intact lands, for example, forest, grasslands. In the forest and grasslands, that means that we want to have avoided emissions. That means that we protect this intact forest or grassland, that we do not deforest, but we keep the forest as it is. That will also provide incentive to store carbon in the soil. And on working lands, that means land for crops, grazing, or forest, plantation forest, that we manage the working lands, that we manage this cropping in the cropping soils or grazing soils or forest soils, so that it can store more carbon. And the third one is that we need to restore, for example, forests or wetlands or peatlands, so that it doesn't emit more CO2 in the atmosphere. So you probably heard about wetlands or blue carbon. That means that areas in the coastal area, in the coastal hutan bakau, in the mangrove areas, there are opportunities to increase the amount of carbon in the soil or in the sediment, because carbon in the mangrove area, which have always saturated with water, when we plant mangrove, it will trap carbon in the soil. But there's also tidal marshes and also seagrasses that can take up CO2 in the atmosphere and put it in the soil. So this is one of the attractiveness that what we call as a natural solution or low technology, but available to areas in the coastal area. For example, in Indonesia, there is a large area of a coastal area. That means there is an opportunity for capturing carbon in this mangrove area. That's why it's called blue carbon, because it's influenced by the water, which is blue in color. That's why it's called blue carbon. But let me talk about the second options here about carbon sequestration on the working land, cropping land. That means we need to increase the carbon in the soil carbon sequestration. Sequestration meaning the process of increasing the carbon content of the carbon pool, in this case, the carbon pool in the soil. So we need to have practices and technologies for sequestering soil carbon. That can be best management practice or frontiers technologies. What do we mean best management practice? Using conventional technologies. For example, improve annual crop rotation. That means that if we have a more diverse crop rotation, more diverse crop, not just monoculture, that means that we're going to have an increased diversity in crops and increase diversity in microbial diversity and also soil carbon. Improve pasture and grazing. So there are areas where we can improve in terms of pasture. Some areas that have been degraded, we can restore the grassland. The peatlands that have been degraded, we can restore it, or alternatively, agroforestry. That means with coupling between the forest and forest, for example, not necessarily forest, but tree plants, for example, cocoa or cocoa trees or other types of trees and cropping areas. But there are also frontiers technologies that are still under development. For example, root phenotyping. That means that we select the crops that have deeper roots or produce more roots, and there are alternatives as perennial grains that can grow for a longer period of time. And there's also alternative of creating biochar from organic waste amendment, or probably there's also opportunities for engineered soil microbiomes. So these are all alternatives, and there's a lot of studies that have been published related to mitigating climate change. And the second adapt is to do with adaptation. And one of the most important problem for climate change is that there will be more frequency of drought, and how can we manage it? To manage drought, there are different options, not only soil option, but of course that we need to select the crop varieties that are more resistant to drought. And the second one is conservation agriculture, which is related to soil. And the third one is seasonal climate forecasting. That means we need to know what is going to happen in the next few months, whether drought is coming or the availability of water. And the fourth one is soil water management, and finally decision support. So I will talk more about the conservation agriculture. Conservation agriculture, that means that we need to have agriculture that conserve the soil. So why do we need to conserve the soil? Because most agricultural soils, we see that the amount of carbon in the soil, since it has been cultivated, it has been declined continually. This is, for example, this data is from North Sumatra, where there is a continuous tobacco and sugarcane plantation. So in the 1970s, the carbon content in the soil is around 1.5%. But because it has been continually cultivated, the soil, there is no rest. Over in 2000, it has decreased to only around 0.5 to 0.6%. So this decrease translates into a yield decrease. If we see that the production in the 1970s is almost 1 tons per hectare, but over in the 2010, it has been reduced more than half because of the decline in soil organic carbon. This is producing in terms of tobacco in Sumatra, in Indonesia, and many parts of the world, that we can see that this is if the initial carbon content, after years of the clearance of the forest, we can see that the carbon content has declined to 30 to 40% after 10 to 20 years of clearance. And in some cases, if the management is not done properly, it can decline up to more than 50% after 20 years of cultivation. But this type of cropping depends on how we manage the soil. This is a data from the study in Central Sulawesi, that this is the cropping after 10 years of conversion from forest. And this is relative carbon content relative to the forest, means that it's under forest. So if under maize cultivation, if continuously producing maize, we can see that the carbon content after 10 years declined to 50%. Over time, it declines. But if it's under agroforestry, in this case, cocoa plantation, the carbon content also can increase. So even 80% compared with the natural under forest. That means that under different kinds of cultivation, under different types of management, we can actually maintain or even increase the carbon content in the soil. That's what we mean by conservation agriculture. That means that we have to have minimum mechanical soil disturbance, especially this is in European or Western countries. We have tractors, we have mechanical soil disturbance to cultivate the soil. And the second one is that we need to have a permanent soil cover, that we cannot leave the soil bare. And the third one, we need to incorporate diverse crop and pasture. So in conservation agriculture, if we have reduced tillage, if we have a cover crops, that means we have increased organic matter in the soil. We can create soils with better structure. Better structure means that water can go in and increase infiltration and soil water content. And at the end, we have a more drought-resistant soil. That means soil that stores water, still store waters and provide buffer, more resilient into climate change. At least in the European countries, in Australia, in America, now there's a movement called regenerative agricultures, that we want to move from industrial agriculture that disturb the soil, monoculture, and only one type of soil, into agriculture that partner with nature, that we borrow from the nature, that protect the soil, increase the diversity of crops, and do a holistic approach. So what do we mean by that? In one of the principles is that first is that you have to have least disturbance. That means that you don't want to keep plowing the soil. And the second is living root. We always have a root that is living. That means that always the soil is covered. That is a soil armor, cover the soil. And if possible, there's an animal integration, that it's not just cropping, but also include animal. And finally, increase biodiversity. So there's not only one type of crop, but increasing the type of biodiversity in the area. So for example, in a simple circular farming system, this is very common in smallholder farmer in Indonesia, for example. If you have agroforestry, for example, coffee, you have the shade trees, and on the ground you have cover crops. Plants from the shade trees or the cover crops can be fed to the animals. The animals' excrement can be composted, which is put back into the agroforestry in the coffee, for example. And this is a simple circular farming system, which can be adapted, which can be usually produced in a smallholder farmers, for example, in Indonesia. But we can have also more complex circular system. For example, the cover crop for the biomass can be produced into biochar, and the excrement of the animal can be into the digester that produce biogas. It can be a compost, and all of this, depending on what type of system, that you can have a more circular economy. More circular economy, that means that the soil that has crops and animals, that we have reduced nutrient leaching, less reduced leaching, and also less fertilizers that can increase the greenhouse gas emissions. That means that in a circular system, that we have recycling of nutrients that reduce leaching and greenhouse gas emissions. Finally, this is just a brief presentation. I cannot provide much more detail, but soil is an important strategy to address climate change. There are large potentials to restore our soil. There are many soils that are still underperforming or being degraded, and innovative soil management can possibly put soil organic carbon in the soil. And soil carbon is the key to planetary health and human survival. Thank you very much for your time and listening to your presentation. And I'm happy to answer questions if they are available. Thank you very much.